The Hammond Plantation records from Charleston County, South Carolina, contain a peculiar notation dated March 1847. 17 members of one of the wealthiest families in the region fell violently ill over the course of 3 days, and 9 died in agony before dawn on the 4th morning. The physician's report listed acute gastric distress and organ failure. Yet no illness swept through neighboring estates. Stranger still, the family's enslaved cook, a young woman named Celia, who had been purchased specifically for a marriage arranged by the patriarch himself, vanished the night before the first symptoms appeared. For over a century, county officials kept detailed depositions describing the event sealed in a courthouse basement, accessible only to historical researchers with special permission. The testimonies paint a portrait of revenge so calculated, so patient, and so devastating that even the hardened planters of the antebellum South spoke of it in whispers. Before we continue with the story of the Hammond estate and what truly happened behind its columned facade, I need to ask you something. Have you subscribed to this channel yet? If stories like this fascinate you, real historical mysteries that reveal the darkest corners of American history, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from. Now, let's step back to where this nightmare truly began. In the oppressive summer heat of 1844, Charleston County in the 1840s represented the pinnacle of Southern prosperity and the depths of its moral corruption. The low country plantations stretched for thousands of acres, their fields thick with rice and cotton, their profits built entirely on the bodies of enslaved human beings. Among these estates, the Hammond property stood as one of the most profitable, generating wealth that placed the family among South Carolina's elite. The main house rose 3 stories, its white columns gleaming in the brutal sun, its interior cooled by the constant work of enslaved servants wielding palmetto fans. Marcus Hammond had inherited the plantation from his father in 1838, and under his management, the estate had grown to include over 200 enslaved people. He was a man of 43 in 1844, respected among his peers for his business acumen, and feared by those he enslaved for his cold efficiency. Unlike some planters who indulged in visible cruelty, Hammond preferred a system of absolute control maintained through calculated reward and punishment. He kept meticulous records of every aspect of plantation operations, from crop yields to the births and deaths in the slave quarters. These records, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society, provide a chilling window into the methodical dehumanization that characterized his enterprise. His son Thomas was 22 years old in the summer of 1844, a young man educated at the College of Charleston, well versed in classical literature, and completely comfortable with the system of bondage that funded his gentleman's lifestyle. Thomas was being groomed to eventually take over the plantation, and his father had specific ideas about how that transition should occur. Marcus Hammond believed that a planter's wife should be molded from youth to understand her place in the household hierarchy, to manage domestic slaves efficiently, and to produce heirs without the troublesome opinions that girls from other planter families might bring to a marriage. What happened next reveals the horrifying extent to which enslaved people existed not as humans, but as property to be disposed of according to their owners' desires. In July 1844, Marcus Hammond traveled to a slave auction in Savannah, Georgia. Among the people sold that day was a 16-year-old girl named Celia, described in the auction records as of mixed heritage, literate, trained in household service. The literacy was unusual and suggested she had been raised in a household where someone had violated the laws against teaching slaves to read. Perhaps the child of an enslaved woman and her owner, educated before being sold away. Hammond purchased her for the substantial sum of $900, a price that indicated specific intentions. The other planters at the auction assumed Hammond needed a new house servant, or perhaps a personal maid for his wife. They were wrong. Hammond had purchased Celia as a future bride for his son. The practice, while not openly discussed, was not unheard of among certain planters who viewed it as a way to maintain absolute control over their heirs' marriages while simultaneously ensuring that any mixed-race children born of the union could legally remain enslaved. South Carolina law in the 1840s followed the principle of part sequentum. The child follows the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, her children were enslaved regardless of the father's status. By purchasing a young enslaved woman and designating her as his son's wife in a ceremony that held no legal standing but served his purposes, Hammond could ensure both his son's loyalty to the plantation system and the continuation of the family's wealth through enslaved descendants. Celia arrived at the Hammond estate in chains, transported in a wagon with 3 other newly purchased people. The head housekeeper, an elderly enslaved woman named Ruth, who had served the Hammond family for decades, was instructed to train Celia in the specific ways the household operated. Ruth's diary, discovered in 1923 during renovation work in the former slave quarters and now held in a private collection, provides one of the few direct accounts of Celia's first months on the plantation. Ruth wrote that Celia was quiet and watchful with eyes that took in everything but revealed nothing. She learned the household routines quickly, too quickly, Ruth noted with concern. The child moves through these halls like she's memorizing every door, every window, every face. She asks questions about things a new girl shouldn't care about. Which rooms Master Hammond uses, what foods the family favors when supplies are ordered from Charleston. What Ruth couldn't have known was that Celia was indeed memorizing everything, cataloging information that would become essential to her survival and ultimately to her revenge. She learned that Thomas Hammond suffered from a nervous stomach that required careful dietary management. She discovered that Marcus Hammond was exceptionally proud of his wine collection, particularly a set of bottles imported from France. She observed that the family physician, Dr. Edmund Thornton, visited the estate only when summoned and relied heavily on the descriptions provided by family members when diagnosing ailments. She also learned the full extent of what Marcus Hammond intended for her future. 3 months after her arrival in October 1844, Marcus Hammond informed his son of the arrangement he had made. According to Thomas Hammond's personal correspondence, letters discovered in a trunk in an attic in 1978 and subsequently donated to the South Carolina archives, the young man's reaction was initially one of confusion, then reluctant acceptance. In a letter to a college friend, Thomas wrote, "Father has procured for me a wife of his choosing, though she is not of the class one might expect." He insists this arrangement serves multiple purposes, ensuring both my establishment as master of my own household and the continuation of our prosperity. I confess the situation is irregular, yet I trust Father's judgment in matters of estate management. The girl is comely enough and has been trained to proper domestic obedience. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place on November 15th, 1844 in the plantation's small chapel. No legal marriage license was filed. No minister from Charleston was summoned. Instead, an enslaved preacher named Samuel, who occasionally conducted services for the enslaved community, was ordered to perform a ceremony. Samuel's account, given years later to abolition activists after he escaped to the north via the Underground Railroad, describes a surreal and nauseating event. Master Hammond had me stand before them in my Sunday clothes and speak the words of Christian marriage over his son and that poor child. Samuel recalled, "She wore a white dress that the seamstress had SWN, and she stood there silent as stone while Thomas Hammond took her hand. I could see she was shaking, but her face showed nothing. When I pronounced them husband and wife, according to the master's command, her eyes met mine for just a moment. I saw something in that look that chilled my soul, not fear, not resignation, but a cold calculation that seemed wrong in one so young. It was the look of someone planning something terrible." After the ceremony, Celia was moved from the slave quarters to a small room adjacent to Thomas's chambers. close enough to serve his purposes, but separate enough to maintain the appearance of propriety before visitors. The door to her room locked from the outside. For the next 2 years, Celia lived in a state of captivity within captivity, forced to serve as wife to a man who owned her as property. The accounts of what transpired during those years are difficult to piece together, as the primary sources are fragmented and often euphemistic. What is clear from household records is that Celia became pregnant twice during this period. The first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage in the spring of 1008. 145, documented in Dr. Thornton's medical notes as a spontaneous termination, not uncommon in slaves of nervous disposition. The second pregnancy in 1008, 146, resulted in a stillborn child, noted in the plantation record simply as female Negro deceased at birth. Ruth's diary entries from this period grow increasingly concerned. "The girl has changed," she wrote in April 1008, 146, "where once she watched and learned, now she moves through the house like a ghost. But I've noticed something troubling. She has begun asking the kitchen servants about herbs and plants. Specifically, she wants to know about the medicinal plants in the garden, which ones ease pain, which ones purge the stomach, which ones Master Hammond's late mother used to use for various ailments. Old Josiah, who tends the garden, told me she's been collecting seeds and dried leaves, saying she wants to learn healing arts. But there's something in how she asks the questions, too focused, too deliberate." In the fall of 1008, 146, Marcus Hammond announced that the family would host a grand gathering for Christmas, inviting extended family members from across South Carolina and Georgia. His 2 brothers, his sister, their spouses and children, and several cousins were expected to descend upon the plantation for a week of celebration. Thomas's new position as a planter in his own right would be formally recognized, and the gathering would serve as his introduction to the wider family network. For the first time since her arrival, Celia was given expanded responsibilities. She would assist in food preparation and service during the festivities. Ruth protested this decision, writing in her diary, "I told Master Hammond that Celia isn't ready for such responsibility, that we should use the more experienced girls, but he insisted. He wants Thomas's wife to be visible to serve the family she's now supposedly part of. It's a cruel mockery, and I fear it will end badly." Ruth's instincts were correct, though even she could not have imagined how catastrophic the consequences would be. The Christmas gathering of 1008, 146 began on December 20th, when the first relatives arrived by carriage from Columbia. Over the next 2 days, the plantation house filled with 17 members of the Hammond extended family. There were Marcus Hammond's brothers, Robert and William, with their wives and a total of 6 children ranging in age from 7 to 19. Marcus's sister, Catherine, arrived with her husband and 3 adolescent daughters. Several cousins completed the party along with a handful of guests from neighboring plantations. The head cook, an enslaved woman named Flora, who had served the family for 20 years, supervised meal preparations with the assistance of 4 other kitchen workers. Celia was assigned to prepare the preserves, pickled vegetables, and special sauces that would accompany the main courses. She was also responsible for serving the wine and preparing after-dinner cordials. According to depositions given after the events that followed, Celia performed her duties with unusual efficiency during the first 2 days of the gathering. Several family members commented on the quality of the meals and specifically praised a particularly delicious plum preserve that accompanied the roasted fowl served on December 22nd. The family's children enjoyed a special sweet cake that Celia had prepared, and Marcus Hammond repeatedly refilled his glass from a decanter of spiced wine that she had placed in his study. On the evening of December 23rd, the family gathered for their largest meal yet, a feast that included roasted pig, venison, oysters brought from Charleston, and an array of side dishes and desserts. The meal stretched over 3 hours with multiple courses and generous servings of wine. Everyone ate heartily except Celia, who stood in the corner of the dining room with the other serving staff, ready to refill glasses or clear plates as needed. By midnight, the first person fell ill. Marcus Hammond woke his household with violent retching. Within an hour, his wife was similarly afflicted. By dawn on December 24th, all 17 family members were experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress. Dr. Thornton was summoned urgently from Charleston. His initial diagnosis, documented in his medical notes, was food poisoning, perhaps contaminated oysters or spoiled meat. He prescribed palliatives and bed rest, assuring the family that the illness would pass within a day or two, but the symptoms did not improve. Instead, they worsened dramatically. By the afternoon of December 24th, the younger children were crying inconsolably, their small bodies racked with painful cramping. The adults fared little better, with several losing consciousness periodically. Blood began appearing in their vomit. Dr. Thornton, now deeply concerned, expanded his diagnosis to include possible cholera, though he noted the absence of the disease in surrounding areas made this unlikely. What Dr. Thornton didn't know, what he couldn't have known without the toxicology knowledge that wouldn't exist for another 50 years, was that the Hammond family members weren't suffering from disease or contaminated food. They were being systematically poisoned. On Christmas morning, as the family lay suffering in their beds, the overseer discovered that Celia was missing. Her small room was empty, her few possessions left behind except for one item. The white dress she had worn at her forced wedding was laid carefully on the bed along with a single sheet of paper. The note, written in the careful script that revealed her forbidden literacy, contained only one sentence: "I pray that God grants them the mercy they denied me." The discovery of Celia's disappearance transformed the household's understanding of what was happening. Marcus Hammond, despite his severe illness, demanded that the enslaved workers be gathered and questioned. The overseer, a brutal man named Collins, who handled discipline on the plantation, began interrogations immediately, using methods that the historical record only hints at through euphemistic phrases like intensive questioning and forceful examination. But the enslaved community, when questioned, provided no information about Celia's whereabouts. Many claimed they had barely known her, that she had kept to herself during her time on the plantation. Ruth, when questioned, admitted she had noticed Celia's interest in medicinal plants, but insisted she had seen nothing suspicious in the girl's food preparation. Dr. Thornton, upon learning of Celia's flight and seeing the note she'd left behind, began to reconsider his diagnosis. On December 26th, he wrote in his medical journal, "I am beginning to suspect a deliberate act of poisoning, though I cannot determine the agent used. The symptoms, severe gastric distress, bloody emesis, progressive weakness, and the peculiar timing of the onset, suggest a toxic substance rather than natural disease. If this girl possessed knowledge of poisonous plants, she may have introduced something into the family's food over several days, allowing the toxin to accumulate in their systems." His revised analysis was tragically correct, though he lacked the medical knowledge to provide treatment even with this understanding. By the evening of December 26th, Marcus Hammond's youngest nephew, a 7-year-old boy named Edward, became the first to die. His small body simply gave up after 3 days of unrelenting suffering. The deaths came swiftly after that. 2 more children died on December 27th. Marcus Hammond's brother, Robert, succumbed on December 28th, followed within hours by Robert's wife. By the morning of December 29th, 5 members of the family were dead, and the survivors were too weak to leave their beds. Local authorities were summoned, and a magistrate arrived from Charleston to investigate what was now clearly a mass murder. Slave catchers were hired to track Celia, with rewards posted throughout the low country for her capture. The magistrate ordered that all food stores on the plantation be examined, and the kitchen workers were detained for questioning. What the investigators discovered in the kitchen shed new light on the methodical nature of Celia's revenge. Hidden behind a loose board in the pantry was a small cloth bag containing dried plant material. A botanist brought in from Charleston identified the contents as seeds and roots from several plants, including white snake root, water hemlock, and what appeared to be oleander leaves, all of which contained toxins that can cause the symptoms the family experienced. Further investigation revealed traces of these substances in the preserves that had been served throughout the Christmas gathering, in the spiced wine decanter in Marcus Hammond's study, and in the special cake that had been given to the children. Most damning was the discovery that the concentrations were carefully graduated. The adults received doses that would sicken them severely, while the children received amounts calculated to be fatal within days. The magistrate's report preserved in the Charleston County Courthouse records describes this as the most calculated act of murder witnessed in this region, demonstrating planning and execution that suggests both intelligence and a depth of hatred that defies comprehension. What the magistrate and other white authorities failed to understand or refused to acknowledge was that Celia's actions were not an expression of mindless hatred, but a desperate response to systematic dehumanization and abuse. She had been stripped of her personhood, forced into a mockery of marriage, subjected to repeated violations of her body, and forced to bear children who would be enslaved by the same system that enslaved her. Her revenge was both personal and symbolic, a reputation of the plantation system's fundamental premise that enslaved people were property without agency or will. Ruth's diary contains an entry from December 30th that suggests she understood this even if she couldn't state it openly. They call what Celia did murder, and by law I suppose it is. But what was done to her? What name do we give to the daily murders of the soul that happened in these quarters? The girl was 16 when they bought her, 20 when she ran. In those years, she suffered things that would break anyone. They broke her in different ways than they intended. They broke her into someone who would do the unthinkable to escape the unbearable. As December turned to January, the death toll climbed. Marcus Hammond died on January the 2nd, 1847, having lived long enough to know that his carefully constructed dynasty was collapsing around him. His wife followed on January 4th. By January 10th, 9 members of the Hammond family were dead, and the 8 survivors were permanently damaged, several suffering from ongoing organ problems that Dr. Thornton predicted would shorten their lives significantly. Thomas Hammond, Celia's forced husband, was among the survivors, though he was never the same. According to later accounts from family friends, he suffered recurring nightmares and health problems for the remainder of his life. He never remarried, never had children, and died in 1863 at the age of 41 from what his death certificate listed as chronic gastric disease and failure of general health. The manhunt for Celia intensified. As the deaths mounted, slave catchers combed the low country with dogs, checking every road leading north, every dock, every known station on the Underground Railroad. Rewards were increased to $1,000, an enormous sum that indicated how desperately the authorities wanted to capture her, both to prosecute her and to make an example that would deter other enslaved people from similar acts of resistance. But Celia had vanished completely. Despite the massive search effort, no trace of her was found. The prevailing theory among the investigators was that she had likely died while attempting to escape, perhaps drowning in one of the many rivers and swamps that crisscross the low country, or succumbing to exposure and starvation in the wilderness. However, documents discovered in the 1960s during research into Underground Railroad networks tell a different story. Letters exchanged between abolitionists in South Carolina and Philadelphia contain cryptic references to the South Carolina bird who flew north on wings of justice and the young woman whose terrible action speaks to the desperation of her situation. While no names are mentioned explicitly, the timing and context strongly suggest these references were to Celia. One particularly intriguing letter dated March 1847 and written by a Quaker abolitionist named Jeremiah Wright describes meeting a young fugitive woman who had committed an act of violence against her enslavers after enduring circumstances horrific to detail in writing. Wright notes that he helped arrange passage for this woman to Canada, where she would be beyond the reach of American slave catchers. If this woman was indeed Celia, she succeeded in escaping not only the Hammond Plantation, but the entire system of American slavery. Yet her escape came at a tremendous cost. 9 deaths, 8 people permanently damaged, and the burden of those deaths on her own conscience, however justified her actions might have been. The Hammond Plantation never recovered from the tragedy. Without Marcus Hammond's management, and with most of the family dead or incapacitated, the estate fell into disarray. Thomas Hammond, the nominal heir, proved incapable of managing the operation. The plantation was sold in 1851 to satisfy mounting debts broken up into smaller parcels, and the enslaved people were sold to different buyers across the region, scattering what had been a community. The story of what happened at the Hammond Plantation during Christmas 1846 was not widely publicized beyond the immediate region. The family members who survived wanted the matter buried, unwilling to acknowledge publicly that an enslaved woman had successfully enacted such devastating revenge against her oppressors. The official records refer vaguely to a tragic poisoning incident without elaborating on the circumstances that led to it. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The magistrate's final report on the Hammond Plantation murders, completed in February 1847 and filed in the Charleston County records, provides the most detailed accounting of how Celia executed her plan. Through interviews with surviving family members, examination of the plantation's records, and consultation with medical experts, investigators pieced together a timeline of poisoning that revealed both remarkable patience and chilling premeditation. Celia's knowledge of toxic plants likely came from multiple sources during her time on the plantation. Old Josiah, the gardener, unknowingly taught her which plants had medicinal properties and which were dangerous. Flora, the head cook, showed her which wild mushrooms were edible and which would cause illness. Ruth's medical knowledge, gained from decades of treating minor ailments in the slave quarters, provided additional information. Celia absorbed all of this, asking questions that seemed innocent but were actually reconnaissance for her eventual plan. The investigation revealed that Celia had been collecting and preparing her materials for at least 6 months before the Christmas gathering. She had dried oleander leaves, gathered water hemlock roots during autumn foraging trips with other enslaved workers, and carefully harvested white snake root that grew in the wooded areas of the plantation. She had tested small amounts on the plantation's rats, a detail confirmed when investigators found several dead rodents in the area near where she stored her materials. What made Celia's plan particularly devastating was her understanding of how to use these substances without immediate detection. Rather than introducing a single, obviously poisonous substance that would cause instant death and immediate suspicion, she used a combination of toxins that created symptoms resembling natural illness. The oleander primarily affected the heart, causing irregular rhythms and weakness. The water hemlock attacked the nervous system, causing tremors and convulsions. The white snake root produced the severe gastrointestinal symptoms that Dr. Thornton initially mistook for food poisoning. She had introduced these substances gradually over the course of several days before the Christmas gathering, building up levels in the family members' systems. The preserves, which were served at multiple meals, contained the oleander. The spiced wine that Marcus Hammond favored was infused with water hemlock extract. The sweet cakes served to the children contained white snake root. By the time the acute symptoms manifested on December 23rd, the toxins had been accumulating for nearly a week. The discovery of her methodology led investigators to examine the plantation's medical records more carefully. What they found painted an even more disturbing picture of Celia's long-term planning. Dr. Thornton's notes from the previous year revealed that she had consulted him twice about stomach ailments, claiming she suffered from digestive problems. During the consultations, she had asked detailed questions about the symptoms of various illnesses and the remedies he prescribed for them. At the time, he had thought nothing of these questions, attributing them to a natural curiosity about healing. In retrospect, he realized she had been learning to mimic disease symptoms and understand how physicians diagnose different conditions. Even more revealing were notations in the plantation supply records. Flora, when questioned extensively by the magistrate, recalled that Celia had volunteered to take inventory of the kitchen stores multiple times over the autumn months. She had shown particular interest in the spice cabinet, asking about which seasonings the family preferred and how different spices affected the taste of foods. Flora had been pleased by this attention to detail, thinking it showed Celia was becoming a dedicated worker. Instead, Celia had been determining which strong flavors could mask the bitter taste of the plant toxins she intended to use. The magistrate's investigators also discovered that Celia had cultivated relationships with several enslaved workers from neighboring plantations during Sunday gatherings when limited movement between estates was permitted for religious services. These workers, when questioned, reported that Celia had asked them about plants that grew in different areas, claiming she wanted to start a small medicinal garden. One woman from the neighboring Singleton plantation recalled that Celia had been particularly interested in hearing about a recent incident where several pigs had died after eating plants near a creek. When shown samples of water hemlock, this woman confirmed it was the same plant that had killed the pigs. Dr. Thornton's later analysis, written in his medical journal after he understood what had happened, expressed a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration. The precision of this crime is extraordinary. The perpetrator demonstrated knowledge of pharmacology that would be impressive in a trained physician. She understood dosing, accumulation, effect, and how to disguise the taste of bitter compounds in sweet and savory foods. That such knowledge was possessed by a slave girl of 20 years suggests an intelligence that was tragically misapplied but nonetheless remarkable. What Dr. Thornton failed to document, but what became clear through the testimonies of the enslaved workers, was that Celia had also carefully observed the family's daily routines and relationships. She knew that Marcus Hammond always took a glass of spiced wine before retiring each evening. She knew that his wife had a particular fondness for plum preserves at breakfast. She understood that the children were allowed sweets on special occasions, and that their parents rarely monitored what they ate during holiday celebrations. She had noted which family members had robust constitutions and which were more delicate, adjusting her doses accordingly. Depositions taken from survivors reveal the psychological horror of their realization. Catherine Hammond, Marcus's sister and one of the survivors, described the moment she understood what had happened. "We had eaten together, laughed together, praised the food that this girl prepared. When I learned what she had done, I felt not only the physical agony of the poison, but the deeper agony of betrayal. Yet in the nights that followed, as I lay weak and suffering, I could not escape a terrible question. What had we done to her that would drive her to such an act? The answer, when I allowed myself to truly consider it, was more poison than anything she had fed us." Catherine's deposition continued with disturbing details about the Christmas gathering itself. She recalled that on December 22nd, during the family's evening gathering in the parlor, Celia had served them all a special cordial she claimed was a traditional recipe for the season. The cordial had a slightly unusual taste, which Celia explained was due to a rare spice she had obtained from a merchant in Charleston. Everyone had complimented the drink, and Marcus Hammond had specifically praised Celia in front of the assembled family, saying she was becoming an asset to the household. Catherine remembered the look on Celia's face during this praise, a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, and a moment where she had seemed to stare directly at Thomas with an expression Catherine couldn't quite interpret at the time. William Hammond, another survivor and Marcus's younger brother, provided testimony that revealed Celia's psychological manipulation extended beyond simply poisoning the food. He recalled a conversation on December 21st where he had complimented Celia's service and asked how she was adjusting to life on the plantation. She had responded with apparent humility, thanking him for his kindness and saying that the Hammond family had been generous to her. She had specifically mentioned how grateful she was for the opportunity to learn so many skills: cooking, preserving foods, understanding the medicinal plants in the garden. William had been pleased by her attitude, interpreting it as contentment with her station. Only later did he realize she had been, in essence, confessing her crimes before they fully manifested, secure in the knowledge that he would never suspect her true meaning. The most haunting testimony came from Thomas Hammond himself. Unlike the other survivors, Thomas initially refused to provide a formal deposition. The magistrate had to compel his testimony through legal means, and even then Thomas spoke only reluctantly. His statement, preserved in the court records, reveals a man shattered by guilt and horror. Thomas described the evening of December 23rd in painful detail. He recalled that Celia had served him personally during the dinner, refilling his wine glass several times and bringing him portions of each dish. At one point she had leaned close to place a plate before him, and he had smelled the scent of lavender soap, the same soap the household provided for the enslaved workers. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but the memory haunted him afterward, the last moment of normalcy before everything collapsed, when he still saw her as merely his property rather than as a human being with agency and will. He described how she had stood in the corner of the dining room throughout the meal, her hands folded, her expression neutral, watching as the family ate. Several times, family members had called her over to compliment the food or request something. Each time she had responded with quiet efficiency. Thomas specifically remembered his father calling her over near the end of the meal to praise the plum preserves, asking her to prepare more for the remainder of the holiday week. Celia had simply nodded and said, "Yes, master, as you wish." Those were the last words Thomas heard her speak. After the meal, as the family retired to the parlor for conversation and music, Celia had been dismissed to clean the dining room with the other servants. Thomas recalled seeing her carry dishes to the kitchen, moving with the same steady calm she always showed. When he went to his chambers later that evening, he had knocked on the door to her adjacent room, something he did nightly to ensure she was present, and hadn't attempted to leave. She had answered immediately, her voice clear through the door, telling him she was preparing for sleep. He had locked her door from the outside, as was his custom, and retired to his own room. That was the last time he had any interaction with her. What Thomas couldn't have known was that Celia had already picked the lock to her room months earlier, using a thin piece of metal she had fashioned from a broken kitchen utensil. She had practiced this skill repeatedly, waiting until the household was asleep to silently open her door, move through the house, and return before dawn. She had used these nighttime excursions to hide her collected plant materials, to test locks on other doors and windows, and to plan her escape route. On the night of December 23rd, after Thomas locked her door, she had waited 2 hours before picking the lock one final time and disappearing into the darkness. The magistrate's investigation traced her likely escape route through examination of the plantation's layout and interviews with patrollers who had been on duty that night. Celia had apparently left through a window in the kitchen house, crossed the plantation grounds under cover of darkness, and reached the river that bordered the eastern edge of the property. From there, she could have followed the river south toward the coast, where underground railroad networks operated among the free black communities and sympathetic whites who opposed slavery. The timing of her escape revealed another layer of her planning by leaving on the night of December 23rd, before the most severe symptoms appeared, but after the toxins were already in the family members' systems. She ensured that no one would be well enough to immediately organize a pursuit. The patrollers who might have tracked her were instead summoned to the house to help care for the sick family members. By the time anyone realized she had fled and that her disappearance was connected to the family's illness, she had a head start of nearly 2 full days. The magistrate's report included a section analyzing what he termed the psychological aspects of the crime, which provides insight into how white authorities struggled to comprehend an enslaved woman's capacity for such elaborate planning. The magistrate wrote, the subject demonstrated capacities for abstract thinking, long-term planning, and emotional control that challenge prevailing understanding of the Negro intellect. She maintained an appearance of submission and contentment for months while secretly planning murder and escape. This suggests either that our assumptions about the mental capabilities of slaves are incorrect, or that this individual was an exceptional case. The court is inclined toward the latter interpretation, as accepting the former would call into question the fundamental justifications for the institution of slavery itself. This section of the report was quietly removed from the public record by local authorities, who recognized the dangerous implications of such reasoning. The copy preserved in the courthouse archives contains handwritten notes in the margins, apparently added by a county official, stating, "This analysis is too inflammatory and must not be widely circulated." It provides argument for abolitionists and could inspire other slaves to similar actions. The Hammond Plantation case became a whispered legend in the Low Country, spoken of in careful euphemisms among planter families who feared similar revenge from those they enslaved. Some estates increased their surveillance of domestic workers, particularly those with access to food preparation. Others attempted to appear more benevolent in their management of enslaved people, hoping that small kindnesses would prevent desperate acts of resistance. The immediate aftermath of the poisoning sent shock waves through Charleston County's planter society. Within weeks of the deaths, neighboring plantations implemented new protocols for food preparation. Kitchen workers were subjected to increased supervision with overseers or trusted house slaves, required to taste all food before it reached the master's table. Some planters went so far as to hire white cooks despite the considerable expense, believing that white workers would be less likely to poison them. Others simply refused to eat anything that hadn't been prepared under direct observation. These paranoid measures created tension and additional suffering in slave communities across the region. Enslaved kitchen workers faced increased suspicion and harsher punishments for any perceived errors in food preparation. Several documented cases exist of enslaved cooks being severely beaten or sold away based on nothing more than a master's stomach ache after a meal. The fear that Celia had unleashed spread like a poison itself through the plantation system, touching countless lives beyond those directly affected by her actions. The financial impact on the Hammond estate was catastrophic and far-reaching. The plantation, which had been valued at over $150,000 in 1846, an enormous sum representing land, buildings, equipment, and the enslaved workers themselves, was worth barely a third of that by 1850. Thomas Hammond, as the surviving heir, inherited massive debts along with the property. His father had borrowed heavily to finance expansion plans, expecting future profits to cover the obligations. Without Marcus management expertise, and with Thomas' health destroyed by the poisoning, those profits never materialized. The estate's creditors began demanding payment. In 1848, Thomas attempted to keep the plantation operating, hiring an overseer to manage the daily operations while he struggled with his ongoing health problems. But the overseer, a man named Garrett, who had worked on several other plantations, found the enslaved workers at Hammond Estate to be troublesome and resistant to discipline. Garrett's reports, preserved in the estate papers, describe frequent instances of work slowdowns, tools mysteriously breaking, and a general atmosphere of defiance. What Garrett didn't understand or chose not to acknowledge was that Celia's actions had fundamentally changed how the enslaved community at Hammond Plantation viewed their situation. Ruth's diary entries from this period describe a shift in consciousness among the workers. They speak of the girl who flew away in whispers. Ruth wrote in March 1847, "They don't say her name aloud, but everyone knows who they mean. Some condemn what she did, especially the killing of the children. Others see her as someone who refused to accept the unacceptable. There's a new kind of silence in these quarters now, not the silence of submission, but the silence of people keeping their own counsel. Master Thomas feels it, too. He's afraid of us now, all of us, even though most of us would never do what she did." This fear manifested in Thomas's increasingly erratic behavior. Workers reported that he would appear suddenly in kitchen house at odd hours, watching the food preparation without explanation. He fired Flora in 1848 despite her decades of loyal service because he convinced himself that she must have known about Celia's plans. He began taking his meals alone in his study and eventually started preparing some of his own food, an unthinkable breach of social protocol for a man of his class. By 1850, Thomas was negotiating the sale of the plantation. The buyer, a merchant from Charleston named Reynolds, who intended to divide the property into smaller parcels for resale, paid $47,000 for land and buildings. That had been worth 3 times that amount just 4 years earlier. The sale included the enslaved workers who were to be sold separately at auction to maximize Reynolds's profit. The auction held in September 1850 scattered the enslaved community that had existed at Hammond Plantation for generations. Ruth, by then in her 70s, was purchased by a local farmer who needed an experienced houseworker. Josiah, the gardener, went to a plantation near Georgetown. Flora, despite having been fired by Thomas, was sold to a family in Columbia. The younger workers were sold to buyers from as far away as Mississippi and Alabama, torn from everyone they had known and sent to places they had never seen. Ruth's diary contains a final entry about the Hammond Plantation, dated the day before the auction. Tomorrow we will all be scattered like seeds on the wind. The place where we lived, lives where we loved and suffered and died, will become just a memory. They think they're erasing what happened here by breaking us apart and selling off the land. But memories don't die so easily. Every one of us who leaves here carries the story of what that girl did. We'll carry it to new places, new quarters, and people there will hear it and remember it. They tried to make her story end with her disappearance. Instead, her story is just beginning to spread. Ruth's prediction proved accurate. Over the following years, variations of Celia's story appeared in slave narratives, collected by abolitionists throughout the South and in free states. The details were often changed to protect those who shared them. The location would shift to Georgia or Virginia. The names would be altered. The specific circumstances would be modified, but the core story remained recognizable. An enslaved woman driven to desperate action by intolerable abuse who struck back with careful planning and deadly effect. One such account appears in an 1855 narrative collected by William Still, the Philadelphia abolitionist who documented hundreds of fugitive slave stories. A woman identified only as Sarah from South Carolina described escaping her enslavement after witnessing a terrible vengeance on a neighboring plantation. Her account doesn't name Celia or the Hammond family, but describes a young enslaved woman who used her knowledge of herbs and plants to settle accounts with those who had wronged her beyond forgiveness. Sarah told Still that this woman's actions had inspired her own escape, showing her that enslaved people possessed power even in powerlessness. As for Celia herself, no definitive record exists of her fate after she fled the plantation. If the abolitionist letters referencing the South Carolina bird do indeed refer to her, she may have lived out her days in Canada under a different name, carrying the weight of her actions, but finally free. The letter from Jeremiah Wright provides tantalizing details that align with what is known about Celia. Wright describes meeting the fugitive woman in March 1847, just 3 months after the poisoning at a safe house in Philadelphia operated by the Vigilance Committee. Wright's letter written to a fellow Quaker abolitionist describes the woman as young, perhaps 20 years of mixed heritage and bearing the marks of harsh treatment upon her person. He notes that she was remarkably composed for one who had endured such trials and committed such acts. Most significantly, Wright mentions that the woman possessed literacy unusual for an enslaved person and expressed knowledge of medicinal plants that Wright himself, an amateur herbalist, found impressive. Wright arranged for this woman to travel north through the Underground Railroad network, eventually reaching Canada via New York and upstate routes. His letter concludes, "I have helped many souls escape bondage, but this woman troubles me in ways others do not. She killed 9 people, including children, yet I cannot bring myself to condemn her when I consider what drove her to such extremity. Is she a murderer, or is she a prisoner of war who struck back at her captives with the only weapons available to her? I leave such judgments to God, but I know I would do the same in her position, and probably with less patience and planning than she showed." Some historians have theorized that a woman matching Celia's description appears in Canadian census records from the 1850s and 1860s. The 1851 Canada West Census includes a Celia Harris, listed as a 23-year-old widow living in the Buckton Settlement, a community of fugitive slaves near Lake Erie. This woman's occupation is listed as midwife and herbalist. She appears again in the 1861 census, still in Buckton, now 33 years old, still a widow, still working as a midwife. The name change from Celia to Cecilia would have been a natural choice for someone attempting to leave her past behind while maintaining continuity with her original identity. The surname Harris was common enough to provide anonymity. The occupation makes sense for someone with her knowledge of plants and medicines. The listing as a widow provided a socially acceptable explanation for her unmarried status and lack of family connections. If this Cecilia Harris was indeed Celia from the Hammond Plantation, she built a quiet life in Canada, helping to bring new life into the world after having taken lives in her escape from bondage. A notation in the Buckton settlement records from 1008. 163 mentions that Cecilia Harris provided invaluable service during the cholera outbreak, using her knowledge of herbs to ease suffering when medical doctors were unavailable. Another notation from 1871 describes her as a respected elder of our community, sought out for her wisdom and her skills in healing. The woman believed to be Celia appears one final time in official records in the 1881 Canada census, listed as 53 years old, still working as a midwife. After that, the trail goes cold. Church records from Buxton's African Methodist Episcopal congregation include a burial notation from January 1889 for a Cecilia Harris, aged approximately 61 years, died of pneumonia. The brief eulogy notes that she lived a quiet life of service to her community, never married, and left no known descendants. She will be remembered for her healing skills and her kindness to those in need. If this was indeed Celia, she survived for more than 40 years after her escape, living nearly twice as long after fleeing the Hammond Plantation as she had lived before that desperate Christmas. She would have carried the memories of what she had done, the 9 people who died because of her actions for all those decades. One wonders whether she found peace, whether she felt her actions were justified, whether the freedom she gained was worth the price she paid for it. Other researchers believe Celia never made it out of South Carolina, that she died during her escape attempt and her body was never found. The swamps and rivers of the low country are unforgiving, and countless fugitives perished in their attempts to reach freedom. The lack of any confirmed sightings of Celia after December 146, despite the intensive search efforts and substantial reward, suggests to some historians that she succumbed to the elements, drowning in a river or dying of exposure in the wilderness. A third possibility raised by some scholars is that Celia was captured and killed by slave catchers who chose not to report it. The reward for her capture specified that she be taken alive for trial, but slave catchers were not known for their adherence to legal niceties. If they found her and killed her during the attempt to capture her, they might have simply disposed of her body and claimed they never located her rather than forfeit the reward or face questions about why they had killed her instead of bringing her in alive. What is certain is that Celia's act of poisoning the Hammond family represented one of the most successful acts of resistance by an enslaved person in American history. She struck at the heart of a system that treated human beings as property, and she did so with a precision and planning that demonstrated the very humanity that system sought to deny. The broader impact of her actions rippled through low country society in unexpected ways. Several documented cases exist of planters treating their enslaved workers with slightly more caution in the years immediately following the Hammond tragedy. A letter from 148, written by a plantation owner to his son, explicitly references the Hammond case. The terrible events at Hammond's place have taught us all a lesson about the dangers of pushing our people too far. I am not suggesting we soften our discipline, but we must be mindful that extreme cruelty breeds desperate acts. Marcus Hammond thought he could bend that girl to his will completely, and the result was the destruction of his entire family. This awareness, however limited and self-serving, represented a tiny crack in the foundation of the slavery system. For decades, planters had justified their treatment of enslaved people by claiming they were incapable of complex thought or planning. Celia's actions proved otherwise in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. The magistrate's closing words in his report, written reluctantly, acknowledge this. While this court must condemn the crimes committed and express horror at the deaths of innocent children, we cannot ignore the circumstances that produced such desperation. The subject was driven to these actions by conditions that would test any soul. That she possessed the capability to exact such revenge speaks to capacities that our system of bondage insists do not exist in her race. This contradiction should trouble any thinking person. Those words written in 1847 were buried in courthouse records where they would not challenge the prevailing order. The Hammond family survivors ensured that the full details of the case remained sealed for decades, allowing only the barest facts to be known publicly. It wasn't until historians began examining antebellum plantation records in the 1960s and 1970s that the complete story began to emerge. The physical plantation house where these events occurred burned in 1852 under suspicious circumstances, possibly arson by enslaved people being sold away as the estate was liquidated. Today, nothing remains except crumbling foundation stones overgrown with vegetation. The site is unmarked, forgotten except by historical researchers who know what to look for in county records. Local residents in the area sometimes speak of an old plantation that met a tragic end, but few know the specific details of what happened there. Ruth's diary, discovered in 1923, during renovation work in what had been the slave quarters, provides a fitting epitaph for Celia and the impossible choice she faced. In her final entry about the case dated January 1847, Ruth wrote, "They will call her a murderess, and perhaps she was, but she was first a victim, forced into circumstances no human should endure. She chose to fight back in the only way available to her, using the knowledge she had gained and patience she had cultivated. 9 people died because one girl refused to continue dying slowly herself. God will judge whether her choice was right, but I cannot bring myself to condemn her. She did what she felt she had to do to be free. And in this country, we call those who fight for freedom heroes unless they are slaves fighting their masters." The Hammond case also appears in several period documents beyond the official legal records. A Charleston newspaper from January 1847 contains a brief notice about a tragic illness that struck a prominent family, but provides no details about poisoning or murder. This careful language reflects the desire of local authorities to prevent panic among the planter class and avoid giving enslaved people ideas about resistance. More revealing are private letters and diaries from other planter families discovered by historians in various archives. A letter from Sarah Middleton, wife of a plantation owner in a neighboring county, written to her sister in February 1847, describes the Hammond tragedy in coded language. "We have heard disturbing news from Charleston County. You remember the Hammond family, quite prosperous and influential. They suffered a terrible tragedy during the Christmas holiday. Nearly the entire family struck down by a mysterious illness that proved fatal for several. The circumstances are hushed, but whispers suggest it was no natural illness. Martha, I confess this news has made me uneasy. I find myself watching our servants more carefully, wondering what thoughts move behind their placid expressions. We like to believe they accept their station, but what if we're wrong? What if they're simply waiting for their moment?" This letter captures the psychological impact of Celia's actions on the planter class. The seed of doubt she planted about whether the system they benefited from could truly be maintained indefinitely. This mystery shows us that the horrors of American history are often buried in archives and forgotten records, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to look. The Hammond Plantation case reveals not only the brutality of slavery, but the incredible courage and intelligence of those who resisted it, even at tremendous personal cost. Celia's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the human response to systematic oppression. She was simultaneously a victim and a perpetrator, someone who suffered unimaginable abuse and who inflicted terrible suffering in return. The children who died because of her actions were innocent of her persecution. Yet, they were also part of a system that denied her humanity from the moment she was born. There are no easy answers in this story, no clear heroes or villains when we look honestly at the complexity of the situation. What we can say with certainty is that Celia refused to accept powerlessness. She studied her captors, learned their weaknesses, planned meticulously, and executed her revenge with devastating precision. Whether we view her actions as justified or monstrous says more about our own values and understanding of extreme circumstances than it does about her. The historical record gives us the facts of what happened during those terrible days in December 1846, but it cannot fully capture the emotional truth of Celia's experience. We can read the depositions and examine the physical evidence, but we cannot truly know what it felt like to be her. To be 16 years old and sold at auction, to be forced into a mockery of marriage, to lose 2 pregnancies under brutal circumstances, to live every day as someone else's property with no hope of legal remedy or escape. We can only imagine the depth of desperation required to decide that killing 9 people, including children, was preferable to continuing to live as she was. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Celia was justified in her actions? Or do you believe the taking of innocent lives can never be justified regardless of circumstances? Do you think she made it to Canada and lived out her life as Cecilia Harris? Or do you believe she died during her escape? Leave your comment below with your thoughts on this deeply troubling chapter of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex dark corners of our past. Until next time, remember that history is never as simple as we might like it to be, and the people who lived through these terrible times made impossible choices that we can barely comprehend from our comfortable distance.